The reading lesson for this morning is from Genesis chapter 28, verses 10 through 19a. Listen now for what the Spirit says to the church. Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord, and the Lord said, "I am the Holy One, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, "Surely God is in this place, and I was not aware of it." He was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven." Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head, and he set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called that place Bethel. The word of the Lord.
Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Jacob was running for his life, trying to escape the fury of his twin brother Esau. The rivalry between the two went all the way back to the beginning when they were struggling to share precious space in utero. Even the birth itself was a nasty competition, but Esau managed to emerge first with Jacob grasping his heel. You wouldn't think that a minute or so would matter much in the larger picture of family relations, but according to the law of male preference primogeniture, all rights of succession went to the firstborn son. Sometimes a minute can change everything. Because he was manly and loved hunting game, Esau was their father Isaac's favorite son. Jacob, the quiet one, was their mother Rachel's favorite son. Though he was not as big and strong as his older twin, Jacob, with help from a very protective mother, could take care of himself just fine because he was clever, manipulative, calculating, and deceitful. It works. One day he took advantage of Esau's impulsive nature and his hunger after a long day in the field, and to manipulate him into selling his birthright for a bowl of lentil stew. Delayed gratification clearly wasn't Esau's strong suit, but Jacob had no problem with it. He was ambitious, but he could wait, and so he did, until their father had grown old and his eyes were dim and his death was fast approaching, and it was time for him to bless the elder son. In a scheme hatched by his mother, Jacob took advantage of Isaac's frailty and poor vision to trick him into bestowing the blessing on him instead. For Esau, this was the last straw. When he learned what had happened, he went into a rage and vowed to kill his brother as soon as the mourning period for Isaac was over. Rebekah got wind of Esau's plan and arranged to have Jacob flee to Padan Aram to marry one of her brother's daughters. And Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran and came to a certain place and stayed there for the night because the sun had set. There was nothing special about this place. No burning bush or majestic mountain. It was just an ordinary place. And Jacob was just an ordinary, very flawed human being running from his brother and no doubt from God. And though he might have wanted, and I'm sure he probably did want to keep running that night, it was dark and he needed to sleep. So he stopped. And not having taken the time to pack something soft for a pillow, he looked around and found a rock to serve as a pillow. And then he lay down and drifted off, hoping that all he would get was a stiff neck and a sore back, but fearing that he would probably also get discovered by a wild animal, or worse yet, by his brother Esau. Instead, he had a dream. In it, the God of his ancestors stood before Jacob and gave to him the same promise given years earlier to his grandfather Abraham. I will give you the land on which you are lying, and descendants enough to cover the face of the earth, and through them all people will be blessed. And then God spoke these words, I am with you, and I will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Even in a dream that must have taken Jacob's breath away. He was not expecting anything good on that journey, but there in the most ordinary of places, to an ordinary and not very worthy man, in the midst of a family drama of his own making, God spoke the ancient promise and words of accompaniment that we all long to hear. And that ordinary man didn't do what I confess I probably would have done had I been in his place, which is to brush the early morning cobwebs out of my brain and dismiss the dream as a fear-driven fantasy, or blame it on the mushrooms and berries that I had eaten before laying my head down on the rock the night before. Instead, when Jacob woke from his sleep, he thought to himself, surely God is in this place, and I didn't know it. This place, this ordinary place, is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. God had used a very ordinary person in a very ordinary place in ordinary times to reaffirm the divine promise of presence and protection and blessing. And because he was not yet too jaded to believe that this was indeed God's doing, Jacob was forever changed. In that moment, Jacob learned that he was not alone, that he belonged, that he was loved, and that God could and would use him, even him, to bless the world. If you read the Bible, all of it, the whole thing, not just the stories about parting seas and prophetic visions and miraculous births announced by angels, but all of it, you see that it's about families and politics, droughts, famine, feasts. It's about feuds and wars. It's about planting and harvesting. It's about laws, lots of laws, given and broken. And it's about in-laws, lots of in-laws. And it's about births and death, kindness and greed, and sorrow and sickness, lots of sorrow and sickness. It's even about losing and finding coins, for heaven's sake. How mundane can you get? The Bible is about ordinary people in ordinary communities and the sometimes mind-numbingly ordinary stuff that happens in our ordinary days. And the miracle is that this is what God works with. Ordinary, flawed people in ordinary places and ordinary times doing ordinary things, like lying down, hoping to get some sleep, and hoping that when you do, your worst fears won't catch up to you. You don't have to be smart or holy or even particularly good to find God, because God finds us. That may happen in the peak moments of our lives or in our deepest despair. It may happen in holy places and holy seasons, but more likely, it will happen in everyday moments and everyday places, because that's where we spend most of our lives, and that's where God does God's best work. We don't have to be especially good or holy. We just have to be open, our eyes open and our hearts open, to recognize and to receive God's presence. There is not a sacred world and a profane world. It's all sacred. It's all God's workshop. There is not a spiritual world and a material world. It's all one. And as Paul said in his first letter to the Corinthians, God is all and in all. There may, in fact, be thin places, as the Celts call them, places in the world where the membrane between heaven and earth is so thin and permeable that it feels like you could glide effortlessly from one realm to the other, like the angels ascending and descending the ladder in Jacob's dream. Such places may exist, and if they do, I would love to find myself in one someday. But I wonder if thin places may be what ordinary places become when we pay attention, like Jacob did. I wonder if we are traveling through thin places all the time, even or especially in our most ordinary times. After all, isn't that just another way of saying that we are always moving in God's presence? Of course we are. We just have to pause long enough to see, hear, smell, touch, and taste just how close the Holy One always is. We have to be willing to feel awe, to let ourselves be captivated by beauty, to allow God to break into our grief and into our busyness and into our grasping with a glimpse of the extraordinary magic and majesty of the mundane. Poet Mary Oliver found awe and beauty in the taste of wild plums and in white owls and grasshoppers. My geologist husband George found it in rocks, in the layers and layers of histories in canyon walls, or even in a simple stone, all that they could reveal and that he could read, and that he had a sense, looking at it, of awe, and knowing that he had a place in God's extraordinary, ordinary creation. Some people always seem to have their eyes and their hearts open, ready to receive God's grace in the seemingly ordinary times and ordinary places of their ordinary days. In these past months, my morning walks have often been times of grieving. That's not my plan, it's just what I get these days. But every now and then, something breaks in through the grief and reminds me that God is still there walking alongside of me. One morning, it was a woodpecker that I had been hearing in the same tree every morning, day after day, but I had never been able to see. But that morning, there it was, glorious, beautiful. Another morning, it was a fox that darted right in front of me, his magnificent tail trailing behind. And sometimes it's just making eye contact with another person who returns the gaze and a smile. Little inconsequential things that remind us that we're not alone, never have been, never will be. that we're each one a small and necessary fragment in a cosmic community, no greater or less than the sky that covers us or the beetle underfoot. We belong. Octavia Butler once wrote, "The world is full of painful stories. Sometimes it seems as though there aren't any other kind. And yet I find myself thinking how beautiful that glint of water was through the trees." I want to end my reflections with the reflections of the young woman I mentioned earlier, Cole Arthur Riley, from her book called Black Liturgies. The meditations in the book are in the form of letters. This is letter 4 to those that rest on park benches. I drove to the lake to write this letter. Perhaps I thought it would move me, looking out into the distance. But my eyes are bothering me today, so I can't stare at the lake. It's too bright toward the sun. But to my left, there's an old man trying to fly a kite with a child. I've decided it's his grandson. I pivot my body just so to watch them twist and tug at the string. The purple nylon octopus stares up at me with mouth agape as it thrashes and flaps against the grass. And the old man is saying, "Take it and run, take it and run." And the boy does, only there always seems to be a pause between the passing of the string and that first step. So the kite drifts up for a moment, then crashes back to the ground. And maybe on another day this would be a tragedy. But the man and the child are laughing hard enough for all of us. The man begins grabbing the octopus by the mouth and shooting it like a dart toward the sky. "Now run, go." And the boy just rocks back on his heels and laughs. You might wonder if they ever got it in the air, if the octopus took flight and soared above us as we marveled and clapped. That is not this story, and it never met the sky, not this day. But now they're sitting on the bench next to mine, sharing orange slices. Have you ever been doing something and suddenly you realize that you're smiling, like your whole face is playing a trick on you? Well, I'm grinning now as I watch sideways from my bench. They're squirting juice from the oranges at each other. The boy licks it up off his hand and puts it out for a handshake. The man nods and solemnly obliges. A small head tucks into his sticky arms. There are days when the sun is too bright, when the majestic feels like the kind of beautiful you cannot approach. Look to your left. The beauty you seek can be found in the mundane. A man holding a boy, holding a worn nylon octopus, and maybe you're grinning too. In a time when we have more access than ever before to the traumas of this world, how will you resist the tide of despair? Let beauty be your anchor. If you find the lake view too bright, bring your gaze closer, perhaps all the way to your own flesh and blood. Life is monstrous on the threshold of apocalypse. The practice of beholding, this fidelity to beauty in all things, I've come to believe, is no small form of salvation. In awe, see. Friends, may it be so for you and for me, ordinary people, making our way through ordinary and often difficult times.